Where is the Brooklyn Bridge by Megan Stine, illustrated by John Hinderleder. Where is the Brooklyn Bridge? New York City. It was a bitterly cold day in the winter of 1853. The wind beat against the passengers on a ferry boat. The boat was trapped in the East River, stuck between huge chunks of ice. But the passengers had to put up with it. The ferry boat was the only practical way to get from New York City to Brooklyn. New York was an island, surrounded on all sides by water. In those days, nearly everyone who came to New York or left it traveled by boat. 15-year-old Washington Roebling was on the ferry that day with his father, John Roebling. At 46, John Roebling was the most famous bridge builder in America. He was a genius and a gentleman. He was also a very tough man. He had strong opinions and not much patience. If someone was even 5 minutes late for an appointment, he'd cancel the meeting and send the person away. For a man like John Roebling to be stuck for hours on a boat, doing nothing, wasting time, was pure torture. It was especially hard for Roebling since all he had to do was look around and he could imagine a better way to travel. There should be a bridge here, a bridge connecting New York and Brooklyn. Right there and then, he imagined the Brooklyn Bridge in his mind's eye. But it would take 30 more years before the bridge would be finished, and John Roebling would be long dead. Chapter 1. We Need a Bridge. In the 1860s, Brooklyn was a separate city. It did not become part of New York City until 1898. In fact, Brooklyn had grown to be the third largest city in the country. Everyone knew that New York City was a much more exciting place, but not everyone could afford it. Besides, New York City was very crowded, except for open pastures far uptown where no one ever expected to live. Downtown, there were low houses and other buildings covering nearly all the land. If more people wanted to live in New York, where would they go? No one could imagine that someday New York City would be full of skyscrapers. The city would grow up toward the sky. Back in the late 1800s, everyone thought that when New York was full, people would spill into Brooklyn. There was plenty of room in Brooklyn for new houses, factories, and shops. The only problem was those ferries. In bad weather, they were slow. Sometimes they didn't run at all. For years and years, people had hoped for a bridge across the East River. But there were difficulties. First of all, the river was always full of boats and tall ships. The boats were extremely important. They brought food, lumber, tools, and people to the city each day. If a bridge were to be built across the river, it would have to be very tall so the ships could sail under it. People also worried about the cost of a bridge and how the city would pay for it. A bridge would cost millions of dollars. Back then, many workers earned only $1 or $2 a day. Most of all, people worried about whether a bridge would be safe. Was it possible to build a sturdy, strong bridge that would reach all the way across the wide river? One that would be high enough over the water to allow for all the boats sailing under it? The only kind of bridge that would be high enough for all the boats was called a suspension bridge. A suspension bridge holds up a roadway with huge, thick cables. Many suspension bridges had been built all over the world, but none were as long as a bridge over the East River needed to be, and a lot of them were falling down. The engineers who designed and built them were making mistakes. 1 out of every 4 bridges collapsed. In France, a suspension bridge had collapsed while soldiers were marching across it. 200 men died. In America, a small bridge in Kentucky collapsed while a herd of cattle was crossing it, and everyone knew about the problems with a bridge in Wheeling, West Virginia. In 1854, just 5 years after it was built, a big wind came along. The whole bridge twisted up into the air like a ribbon in the wind. But John Roebling was sure he could build a bridge that wouldn't fall. He owned a wire company, and using wire, thick, strong ropes of it, was one of the keys to building a good suspension bridge. He had already built 3 wonderful bridges using wire. If he could just show people his other bridges, he felt sure they would have faith in his plan. In April 1869, Roebling took a group of 22 people on a trip called the Bridge Party. The group included engineers who thought the Brooklyn Bridge couldn't be built. It also included businessmen and politicians who very much wanted it. By train, they traveled to Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Niagara Falls. They went to see the 3 suspension bridges that John Roebling had built using huge cables made out of wire. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Roebling showed off his most beautiful bridge. It had tall, fancy iron towers. The sides of the bridge had hundreds of crisscrossing wires that looked like the bars of a cage or netting. In Cincinnati, Ohio, he showed them the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time. It crossed the Ohio River and was 1,057 feet long. It took no time for horse-drawn carriages to get across it. It was also a wonderful place to walk and enjoy the river. When the bridge party walked on the bridge, they could feel how sturdy it was. But the best stop of the trip was the visit to Niagara Falls in New York State. There, John Roebling's bridge was suspended high above the Niagara River with the famous waterfalls in the background. The scenery was incredible. Better yet, the bridge had an important extra feature. It was strong enough for a train to go across. When the trip was over, all the experts agreed that John Roebling was the right man to build the Brooklyn Bridge. It wasn't called the Brooklyn Bridge at first, though. One idea was to name it the Empire Bridge, or the East River Bridge. For a while, everyone just called it the Great Bridge. John Roebling went to work right away. He had already designed the bridge. It was going to have 2 tall stone towers. The towers would hold up thick cables, and the cables would hold up the roadway. Now he hired engineers to draw designs of the bridge's different parts. He hired more engineers to oversee the carpenters, masons, and builders who would do the actual work. Hundreds of men would be needed over the months and years to build the bridge. Roebling also needed someone in charge of all the workers to make sure the bridge was built correctly. His son, Washington Roebling, had graduated from the best engineering college in America called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So Roebling decided his son would be his right-hand man. Perhaps one day his son would take over and be in charge of building the bridge. Washington Roebling moved to a house in Brooklyn Heights near the river. That way, he would live just a few blocks from the worksite. John Roebling spent most days at his home in Trenton, New Jersey. It was right beside his wire factory. When the final plans for the bridge were approved on June 25, 1869, John Roebling came to Brooklyn. 3 days later, he and his son went down to the East River to discuss locations for the bridge. John was standing at the end of the ferry slip, right at the edge of the river where the ferry boat docked. As the huge ferry hit the wooden pilings, it smashed into his foot. John Roebling collapsed to the ground. His foot was crushed. His son quickly took him to a doctor nearby. It was a terrible injury. His toes had to be cut off. Roebling let the doctors do it right away. Then he insisted on wrapping up his foot himself. He was so stubborn, he wouldn't do what the doctors told him to do. He fired 2 doctors and bossed around the 3rd one. He thought he knew better than everyone else. For a few days, it seemed like John Roebling might be okay. He stayed at his son's house in Brooklyn Heights. But then, instead of getting better, he started getting worse. He had horrible headaches. He couldn't eat. He couldn't even open his mouth. His face was frozen. Every so often, his body would suddenly twist into painful shapes. The doctor knew what was wrong. Roebling had a disease called lockjaw. It is also known as tetanus. There was no cure for it in those days because this was long before medicines such as penicillin had been discovered. A few weeks later, on July 22nd, 1869, John Roebling died. He was gone before work on his most important bridge had even begun.